Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Neil Tychon, and oddly enough, I was joking earlier, it actually happened. I had a little bit of snow this afternoon coming down, and my guest today had to go through the snow to work. In his case, it makes sense. In mine, it doesn't, because it should be spring. But today, I'm joined by a, dare I say, old friend, long acquaintance at this stage. And looking at his record, an odd fellow. He got his BA, or I should say his BS. I love that terminology after all. His BS from Georgia Institute of Technology, or better known as Georgia Tech. Got a master's at Johns Hopkins, and then went to the University of Calgary for his PhD. And for some reason, it must be a great place up there because he's still there as an assistant professor now, working in, I thought there was a study center that you initially were with, but that has disappeared. So you are just a Department of History guy now, Beau.
I'm also a research fellow at the Center for Military, Strategic, and Security
Absolutely.
Studies. They've added an extra S to it. There's security now as well,
Yeah,
which is
perfect.
an interdisciplinary research center here at the U of C, as we call it, because they've never heard of the University of Chicago up here.
Well, on the other hand, now you can properly prepare Canada for the war against the United States.
That's right. I am. I have to worry if they're going to think I'm a sleeper agent or what. But it's given my previous background, perhaps I'm well suited for for leading guerrilla resistance, both
There
in my
we
research
go.
and my former professional life in the Army.
There we go. All
Yeah.
right. So you already heard the guest. It's Beau Cleland, and the work we are going to talk about is this new book, long awaited, long expected, Between King Cotton and Queen Victoria: How Pirates, Smugglers, and Scoundrels Almost Saved the Confederacy, published by the University of Georgia Press. So I'm going to start easy and let's ease into all of this and ask you, like, how did you become interested in Bahamas, Bermuda, and Canada? Because that's the three areas you're looking at.
That's right. The three places that everyone always groups together, of course, when they imagine North America.
It's
No,
great for a
so this
vacation.
project, they actually they really are, even though we are getting snow in late March, which is actually not unusual out here. Uh, yeah. So this book, in some ways, had its origins in my previous career in the U.S. Army as an Army officer. I served in Afghanistan and Iraq, and after I eventually got tired of being in danger in the desert, and I got out of the from active duty in the Army to go to graduate school. And my initial grad studies were in international relations and strategic studies at Johns Hopkins. And while I was there, I was working as a research assistant for one of the faculty members there, and I came across a report of, for Civil War folks, you'll have heard of the St. Albans raid or, the raid in Lake Erie and Johnson's Island. But I hadn't at that point. It was new to me, and I started to wonder. Well, this is unusual. What are they doing? Why are they there? And the more I dug into it, the more I thought this seems a lot like the kind of transnational insurgency that I was encountered in my military experience. And that those questions of who are we fighting, why, and where are they coming to and going from, kind of animated my studies in my master's program. And as I dug in more at this book, my undergraduate degree I have a Bachelor of Science in History, Technology, and Society, which is a very Georgia Tech thing to do. And so my background training was in history, and I wanted to keep doing that. And so that sparked me to pursue graduate study on history. And so, this topic, these raids out of Canada were the initial hook. Initially, I thought the project was just going to be about that. But the more I dug into these networks for my dissertation work, the more I realized that these were not an isolated one group just in Canada, but they in fact were part of a broader kind of transnational network of merchants, of soldiers, of minor officials, of all sorts of ne'er-do-wells and sailors that connected most of British America, not just British North America, which was the overall name for the places that are now Canada. But there are deep connections in Bermuda and the Bahamas, to a lesser extent in other places in kind of the Circum-Caribbean, British Honduras or Belize, for example. But really, they were really anchored in Nassau in the Bahamas, in St. George's, Bermuda, and then in spots across what's now Canada, especially Halifax, Toronto, and St. Catharines in what's now Ontario, and Montreal, of course, where John Wilkes Booth stuck his toes into this network. So yeah, that's for the very short version. That's where this started. It was my dissertation project, and it's been cleaned up and added to make this book. It was a long time coming. You're not wrong. This is a good 10 years of work here by the end of things.
So I'm gonna have to take a little. I'm currently working on a book with the University of Georgia Press, and like we briefly said before we started, it's not the fastest of processes, but I have to take a dig at one of my reviewers in this situation, because my book deals with the battles around Savannah, and paraphrasing the reviewer, it was something like, well, Savannah isn't really the topic of the book. It's sort of in the background. So I'm going to take a dig at yours, because you put Queen Victoria in the title of your book, but Queen Victoria never really appears in your book.
She certainly does not. And, it was a rhetorical swing on my part to try to link these one existing empire in the British Empire and an aspiring slaveholders empire in the Confederacy. And this also, the King Cotton reference is not accidental there. It's this really is a book about British subjects away from England, especially in the Americas, and Confederate citizens and their supporters running around the hemisphere, kind of on the periphery of the war. So, yeah, well, while I name the two monarchs of the region, cotton agriculture done by the hands of the enslaved, and the monarch in London, but really, it's not about them. It's about people who are running around doing this kind of grassroots work of empire on their behalf, but especially on Confederate behalf.
I will send that to Nate as the editor to make sure that he understands why I use Savannah in my title. But joking aside, obviously, yeah. I understand why you would throw Queen Victoria in, considering she's the head of the three colonies that you're talking about. So one thing I kind of want to tackle a little bit, because obviously you're entering a field that, if you look behind me, there is a lot of books already on the subject. There's literally everything there on this, and that shelf is Civil War diplomatic history of some sort or another. So it's a pretty well-established field. So what do you say is the most important contribution that you made with your book?
Yes, that's it's a great point. This is not an unstudied field of Civil War history, and I think maybe one critique that probably all of us who work in this would offer is that it had gotten somewhat stale over the years. It's hard to find new things to say about it, and so I think where my contribution really comes in is this emphasis on non-state, or I mean, perhaps better, maybe we can also say sub-state actors. So people who are not formal diplomats, people who are not in some cases employed by or representing a government at all, can still have really important roles in developing these international connections that really, really mattered in the case of the Confederacy for keeping the war effort alive. And it also lets us kind of picture what sort of reception might an independent Confederacy have received, had it succeeded in its project. And so it's through these grassroots agents that we can see important successes for Confederate, what I call privatized diplomacy or informal diplomacy in the Americas, but also kind of by indirectly there in Europe, because the fact of the matter is these minor people operating in Nassau or in Bermuda or in Canada had much more practical effect for the Confederate war effort than James Mason or John Slidell did in the halls of Europe.
Yeah, and I kind of when I looking at your book, and I already kind of knew what you were doing a little bit since I had heard your talks at conferences before, and Bermuda especially, not Bermuda, the other B, Bahamas, struck me especially because I'm not sure how familiar you are with it, but Charles Ross's book, Breaking the Blockade, I had him
I have read it,
interview still, and there seemed a good bit of overlap. So kind of and there's a book, I can't recall when it came out, but I remember there's something on Bermuda too. So you feel like that you're pulling the stories of these individual pieces now together more, or is that you really kind of changed the way we're thinking about it?
I think it's a little of both, and I have actually spoke with the author of that Breaking the Blockade book. He started writing that after my project began, so I can say I was already doing this. But I have to thank him for helping
So
me
he
find a
stole your
photograph
idea.
of. I have to thank him for helping me find a photograph of Henry Adderley. He pointed me to a place where I could actually locate one, so that he was actually quite helpful. I appreciate it. But so what? Actually, this is if we're speaking of reviewer comments, one of the comments I got on the book proposal was, why are these places connected? I don't,
Mm-hmm.
they really disagreed that they are. And so one thing that I'm trying to do here is to make the case that these places are connected. There is substantial family, business, and kind of governing interplay between all these colonies, especially the Bermuda and the Bahamas. Then there's also strong connections between Bermuda and British North America. And for one example, the British military connections between these places are all fall under one fleet commander, in the person of Admiral Milne. The same captains move in between them. They're all run through the Colonial Office in back in Whitehall in London. And so, there are connections just kind of in a practical governing standpoint, but there's also these social connections between the places. The same bishopry or archdiocese is for the Catholic Church is in charge of Bermuda and the eastern part of British North America. There's lots of travel in between them. The main steamship networks stop at each place along the way, and so they are connected in many ways, not just by the movement of Confederates between them. And so if we think of them individually as kind of siloed, quasi-national histories, then we miss these important transnational connections. And that's because that's really, I think, where, why they mattered for the war, because of they are inherently connected places. They're places of ports, of movement of goods and people and ideas. And not just for the Confederacy, there's also, these are hubs for the movement of anti-slavery ideals among the Black population as well. Which we can talk about as we get into the book a little more. And I'm actually working on a chapter for different collections now that explores that topic further. So they've been written about kind of in siloed national or nationalist history before, but these places are connected, and we need to think of them as this kind of a broader British American periphery to the war.
Yeah, and I kind of was wanting to follow up on that, because one of the things that we usually see when we talk about the international civil war, it's like it's a European capital, right? It's like what are the decision makers in Napoleon III's cabinet doing, or what the members of Palmerston's cabinet are talking about, or what's the Parliament talking about. But it's you're taking the narrative and putting it on the ground in these colonies and kind of seeing how, I think the most fascinating part of this being how different colonial office rules versus application in these places actually is.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a fairly big literature in kind of British Commonwealth imperial studies that look at these dynamics of colonial governance. And it turns out that those things also matter for the American Civil War. And if we only look at what's happening in European capitals, we're going to miss all that. Because we see a number of examples of where the colonial office just finds it easier to accept what a colonial legislature or official does on the ground, because it's harder to overturn worldwide than so they'll accept the actions of these folks that are often, if not at odds with what maybe the interest of the British imperial government might have been, or at least it's not important enough for them to try to overturn it. It's not worth the trouble. And so we see things like allowing the re-registration of ships in colonial ports on a much looser basis than frankly British law permitted at the time. But the colonial office let it go, and then instead of trying to fight with these colonial governors, they just said, you know what, this is the rule for everywhere. And this kind of ironically has the effect of also helping shield northern ships from Confederate raiders later on, because they can also change their registry. But early on, Confederates are using it to hide their vessels from capture by the U.S. Navy. And that's just one early example, but there are lots of those where the colonial office just finds it is not worth the trouble to overturn the actions of these folks in these colonies.
Yeah, and I'm kind of thinking too of like it's we have to think of this period in a different kind of way in general, because there isn't easy communication, so it is
Mhm.
hard for these colonial officials to kind of be like, hey, let me get on the phone with London and see what am I supposed to do. There's a lot more, I guess, sort of quote unquote independence that these individuals have.
Yes, absolutely. They are, and they're kind of, especially in the person of colonial governors, they're often, you know, they don't have much in the way of support. The governor of the Bahamas was already inclined to be sympathetic to the colonies, but he also had no one to turn to. His own colonial legislature was deeply opposed to anything he might try to do to restrict their actions. And if he wanted to ask for permission to do something to the colonial office, it took, best case, he's going to get an answer in a month.
Hmm.
More often, it took much longer than that. Even with steamship transportation, communication was extremely spotty. So yeah, they are operating alone. In some ways, it's akin to naval captains kind of being on the site diplomats across the 19th century world as well.
Yeah, and kind of as a follow up to that too, it's like, so getting a little bit into the book, there's a few more kind of general questions I have too. That why do you think, like, we have various parts in Canada? We have Bermuda, especially St. George, and then you have Nassau in the Bahamas as sort of your central locations. Halifax in Canada really being part of two chapters there. Uh, but why do you feel like these officials were sort of sympathetic, or at least not opposed to the Confederates? Was it just self-interest that, ooh, there was trade and I could make money off of this? Or was this sort of something ideologically deeper that they were kind of interested in or thinking about?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because the governors across these sites, especially in Bermuda and the Bahamas, are
Mhm.
very different people. In the Bahamas, he's a career kind of colonial office official,
Mhm.
Charles Bailey. He's been when the war starts, he's been in his position for a couple of years. But I've seen no evidence that he was personally profiting from
Mhm.
blockade running trade or things like that. I do not get the sense at all that it was corruption. Instead, I think it was uh, an irascible personality. I think he's a fairly educated person. He likes to write in Greek to Lord Lyons in Washington to show off his education.
Mhm.
Uh, but I think he
You usually
resented
read
being.
those letters?
I did. I had to have some help looking him up. Uh, but he's the kind of this figure. I get the sense that in some cases it's animated by kind of latent racism. He's
Mm.
definitely hostile to in his writings in a variety of ways. He is especially hostile to increase black civil rights within the Bahamas. He sees them as a source of trouble, and I imagine he extends that view to black people in the United States as well. He also has very negative personal interactions with the American consuls that show up early in the war. They are. It's sometimes a poor choice of personnel on the American map, especially the first consul, Samuel Whiting, who was often reported to be drunk and insulting to everyone around him. I can't to some extent. I think that may be exaggerated because of they're trying to get him fired. But so there's personal resentment. His interactions with Confederates, by contrast, are with kind of urbane and somewhat sophisticated people who participate in the social life of the islands. And again, Nassau is a boring place if you're from London, and so you're looking for places to make friends and have a good time. The Confederates are your people, and their blockade running allies are the elite of the colony. So I think there's some amount of just social influence there as well, and not wanting to cause trouble with the wealthy elite of Nassau. So being their friend made his job easier. And so, in the case of Bailey in the Bahamas, I think that's what it is. This is harder to explain on those kind of racial grounds in Bermuda, where the governor is an army officer in charge of the garrison there. Because there's a very large naval establishment in Bermuda. There is a big kind of prison works there. They would deport prisoners from the British Islands to live on prison hulks in the harbor and work on defenses there on the islands. And so the governor is a military officer who also has trouble dealing with his kind of local busybodies and so on, and is frequently in conflict with them. But they can't really hurt his career, right? He owes his career to the army. He can give orders to the soldiers that make up a decent chunk of the population. But on the other hand, he's also charmed by Confederate society. This is where women come into the story rather importantly in the person of people like uh, Georgiana Walker, the wife of the Confederate officer who was stationed there in the war. She hosts a big social scene, and the governor is a frequent guest there. She's a charming sophisticate from Virginia society, and I think they find that they don't have the same problem with personality with the American consul. He's actually quite well respected in Bermuda. But on the other hand, they're looking for friends and finding them in the person of the Confederates in their society. They're also being kind of I think there's some rooting for what they see as the underdog in this story too, and both these governors aren't averse to improving the budget situation of their colonies, which the war certainly did help in both places with that, with increased customs revenue and so on. And so I think it's a little bit of everything, right? It makes their job easier if there's more money coming in. It's something different. It's exciting. And the Trent affair didn't help either, right? They both in all places they are soured on the U.S., especially because in both places Charles Wilkes shows up outside the harbor, being let's put it being a jerk. He shows up in Bermuda, sort of blockading the islands, kind of. He can't stay for long. He does the same thing in the Bahamas, and in both places that his presence is presented. He's seen as the example of the arrogant American who's a loudmouth ignoramus who just causes problems. And so I think those things help sour, at least on the official side of the governors, to be inclined to be sympathetic to the Confederacy to differing extents.
The facetious side of me is like wanting to now know how your students feel about you, considering there's a similar dynamic maybe between Canadian students, the American teacher, Canadians with the American outsiders.
If they have opinions at all, I'm very excited because that means they've been paying attention to something besides their phone. So
there you go.
Yeah. No, I think I thread that needle by trying not to wear any red hats with white letters on them to work and things like that. No, it's certainly.
But you in Canada, irony, I mean, it's red.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, no. The irony here is that the situation is very similar in some ways, where that there's a provocative person of American extraction causing problems for a local place, and it is resented. And I just, it's not. It hasn't been a problem. I'm joking, of course, but it has not been a problem for me because, I live here. I'm also affected negatively by these various restrictions, and so I'm generally on their side with not loving what's going on, and then I can be a little more jokey about it in class because the Canadian government is not going to fire me for criticizing what the U.S. government does in the way that it might be if I worked in somewhere like Texas.
Well, at least you don't have Texas in your book.
That's right.
The other part that is kind of interesting about your book is that you're forcing us as diplomatic historians to really resync a little bit how we do things, because we tend to look at Lyons, Mercier, Adams, Dayton, Bigelow, and Shorts maybe, and it is sort of the big diplomatic figures, but you're asking and saying no, it is private individuals at times, and it kind of reminded me in two different ways. In part, it reminded me of sort of the citizen consuls at the United States very often, and many European countries even at the time rely on that. It's like you don't want to pay a person and send a person professionally to a small port that doesn't have enough revenue to justify it, but there's a merchant that you could use, so it's great. But this, on the other hand, is this sort of, does that explain maybe some of the failures of Confederate diplomacy, that they're just not putting as much emphasis on sort of foreign relations in places where, like Bermuda or Bahamas, where it could have mattered?
Well, I think for the Confederates, interestingly, of course, I mean, as you all know, but perhaps the listeners might not be as familiar with the way that the Confederate State Department comes to be. It is, of course, an ad hoc creation. I think it was Robert Hunter, the first Secretary of State. They asked where the Department of State is, and he says it's here in my hat, and the Department of War is in my coat, or something to that effect. They don't have infrastructure. They don't have a body of trained diplomats. And so in some ways they are having to operate from a position of creating everything anew. In some ways it works out for them to lean on these private parties because, one, it's expensive, as you said, to put diplomats in various places. They lack the infrastructure to move people around very effectively and to communicate back and forth. I think more importantly, it goes back to that lack of official recognition, right? They can't put an officially recognized consul in a port because they're not recognized by the government of Britain or anywhere else. And so, but in some ways, they are forced to lean on these private parties for that effect. But I think it's more than just that. I think it is by using these private parties to study this, it helps us understand the sources of pro-Confederate influence in these very important places like Nassau. And it lets us kind of better understand how the interests of these private parties sometimes coincide with and sometimes conflict with what was the desire of the Confederate government or in the British government for that matter, because these are these things are in tension, and it's not just Confederate citizens who are these private parties. They are often colonial subjects who are working for the Confederacy, in some cases directly, in many cases indirectly, both for their own benefit and because in places like the Bahamas, because they sympathize with the Confederate project. And that's the other side of this too, right? It's not local opinion matters. There are many, especially older people in the Bahamas, were alive for British emancipation. They didn't like it, and they were not averse to seeing slavery continue on the continent next door. And so their support, even if they're not advocating for slavery's return in the Bahamas, they have no problem with it existing in perpetuity right next door. And so, and they sympathize with the racial order of the South, and through both kinship and kind of longstanding trade relationships, and because they stand to profit from it personally as well. Yeah.
Well, I guess there's sort of the other part that if you are just a private individual, quote unquote, representing the Confederate States, then there's a lot more that you can do than if you were in an official capacity as, say, an accredited consul.
Yeah, exactly. You can engage in activities that you would not be permitted by or wouldn't be appropriate for, because even though these are private parties and the Confederacy is an inspiring nation, they did, especially if we're going to lean on like Aaron Shee and Dean's work, they do aspire, at least at the start of the war, to adhere to the law of nations and kind of this what they call the civilized usages of warfare and of international conduct, because they wanted to be accepted into what they called the family of nations. And so if you're an officially recognized representative, you can't do things like sponsor pirates or actively promote law breaking and not be ejected from the country or bring shame upon yourself. But if you are just a Nassau merchant who happens to also be working closely with the Confederacy, you can do all those things, and it has the benefit also of providing cover of your nationality to those activities. So the Union Navy can snatch up any Confederate ship it wants. It cannot do so to a vessel carrying a British flag unless it's actually trying to cross the blockade. And the Confederates know that, and their supporters know that, and they lean on that fig leaf of British nationality to protect themselves in all kinds of ways: communications, moving supplies away from these ports, especially cotton, because once it reaches Nassau, then they can send it out relatively safely on to its destination. And so, so these sub-state or non-state, privatized diplomats and representatives and so on, they're really beneficial to the Confederacy because, one, they don't have to create the same sort of diplomatic apparatus as the Union. They couldn't do that probably even if they wanted to. But it's cheaper, it's more effective, and it lets them use the institution of nationality and borders to protect themselves from the United States and from their opponent.
Yeah, but one other part in that, and that's sort of what you go into in your first chapter, is that by having these private individuals with their private interests, these initial privateering activities that come out and take refuge at times or try to take refuge in Bermuda or the Bahamas, there is also sort of a reminder of the antebellum period with filibusters and Southern expansionism. So kind of just in general, how much does that sort of, is that in the minds of people in the region, like that Southerners were always looking at these parts of the world as sort of places where they could take over, or where it's sort of like they act in a lawless fashion?
Yeah. So that antebellum, let's call it suspicion, mutual suspicion, certainly between
You're being nice.
the British Empire in this era and the Southerners is well deserved, right? You have that Southerners were intensely aware of British territory as a refuge for escaped slaves. The Bahamas was the terminus of the so-called saltwater railroad. So, the numbers aren't always clear, but quite a few enslaved people managed to make their escape to the Bahamas. Sometimes just by hiding on or stealing small boats. Sometimes, in the case of the famous Creole affair of 1841, by rising up on a coastwise slave trading vessel, seizing it and sailing it in and forcing the crew to sail them to Nassau into freedom, where they were liberated by British policy. So Southerners resented this, and this I think is really more intense in the 1840s and the early 1850s. There's lots of rhetoric about the British Navy being a sword threatening the South and from its refuges in Bermuda and the Bahamas. Fears of British instigated servile insurrection, as they would have called it. Because they're very much aware of the kind of the hemispheric path of slavery after the Haitian Revolution. And they saw in British emancipation a potential plot. There is some conspiratorial thinking there. But in some ways, the 1850s helps make that a little less intensive. The filibustering attacks of the late 1840s and through the mid 1850s are happening, but they are not targeting British islands for very good reason, because they would not win. And while the Royal Navy is certainly very concerned about stopping these raids, for the most part, on the southern side of things, they are more worried about abolition as a threat from the North rather than from Britain. That the source of their fear shifts a bit in that decade, and you can see the work of quite a few great historians on this. If you like Matthew Clavin's work on Toussaint Louverture and how he's viewed in both South and North in this period, I think is kind of a good animation of that. But so there is these existing kind of British concerns about filibustering. They had long memories as well of American raids against Nassau and other places during the Revolution and the War of 1812. There was some back and forth raiding in the Canadian rebellions of 1837, 1838 by American filibusters crossing the border and attacking into Canada. And so when the war starts, ironically, what the British are most afraid of is American filibusters, probably from the north, in fact, attacking Jamaica or attacking Bahamas. I don't think they took it seriously, at least not in London, but it was a concern for locals. Of course, on the southern side of things, they gradually turned from seeing places like the Bahamas or Bermuda and Jamaica as kind of bastions of abolitionist threat, toward places of opportunity for them, because there's a growing recognition that there is a sympathetic local population here. It is not just the British government in London that is to be influenced here. There are local people many of whom share family connections, especially between Florida and the Bahamas, that had an opportunity there. And so there is a broad shift from attitudes in the decade before the war that helps make places like Nassau, especially, a promising site of informal diplomacy for the Confederates in a way that it probably wouldn't have been considered in the 1840s.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that sort of concern, because that was something I picked up on when I can't remember. I think it was in the first chapter you talked about the kind of Britain's concerns about northern originating filibustering that could cause issues, and then troop movements in kind of defensive in a desire to protect these colonies and defend them, right? And it sort of reminded me of some of the interpretations of the Trent Affair, which you mentioned earlier, because oftentimes the perception there is that, the British are sending these troops to engage offensively against the United States to free Mason and Slidell. But most scholars, I think, these days agree that it's actually intended to kind of for defensive purposes in case the United States makes this a case. But it seems like you're falling into that category to kind of say this is British suspicion and mistrust of what the United States might be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's you see in the dispatches of say the governor of Jamaica to Admiral Milne, the commander of the North American and West Indian Fleet, that he is not worried about Southern raiders or filibusters. He's worried about what the United States will do about either by filibustering raids or by official action. And that's true across the colonies. The Governor General of Canada shares these concerns. The Governor of Bermuda and the Bahamas also, they all write independently with sharing similar worries about a threat from northern aggression, to kind of borrow an unfortunate southern characterization later on. That's what they were afraid of. They weren't afraid of the Confederates, and so. I agree. I think the interpretation of kind of British reinforcement of the Americas in the wake of the Trent affair, I think it is defensive, and they're worried not just about official action but also unofficial raiding across the frontier.
Yeah, and all right, so I have one more point that I want to talk about before we get into the Bahamas proper, and because Bahamas are your first part, and that's. First of all, congratulations. You got the King Cotton diplomacy really well done and well presented, and not like very Harriet Ousley type presentation. So maybe kind of let's talk briefly about the misconception that a lot of people seem to have about King Cotton, that this is not an official Confederate government policy to withhold cotton from the British to force an intervention.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the confusion, although I think is understandable, because the Confederate government was happy to have that confusion going on. So to the very short version, of course, is that the Confederates believed that the European nations, especially the British, were so dependent on cotton for industrial production in Lancashire and in their mills, that they would do anything to keep the flow of cotton from southern ports going out. And so they leaned their foreign policy assumptions when when the war began, when they started the war. Let's not use passive voice here. When they start the war, they assume that the British will intervene on their behalf to keep cotton flowing. Their goal is to allow private associations of merchants or local vigilance committees or of shippers, all of whom are tend to be associated in some way with the Confederate elite, to help restrict the flow of cotton out of Confederate ports, to help twist the screws to encourage British intervention. This is not very well thought through for lots of reasons that other historians have looked at. The bumper cotton crop of 1860 means that there's plenty of surplus already sitting in British warehouses. It turns out that the season is not right for shipping cotton anyway, so the difference isn't felt all that well for several months. And perhaps just as importantly, if your goal is to persuade someone to intervene on your behalf, perhaps letting it be known that you are extorting them deliberately will not get the effect that you want. And so there's this fundamental contradiction where you have Confederate diplomats at the same time appealing to Britain to intervene because they need cotton, while also saying, look, the blockade is illegal and therefore because it's ineffective because all these ships can come in and out of the ports. And then when the British ask, well, why is no cotton coming out then? They don't have an answer. So either the blockade is working and you're withholding cotton and cotton can't get out, or it's not working but you're withholding it from us deliberately. They painted themselves into a corner there, sort of thoughtlessly. And Palmerston and Lord Russell in London, they're not stupid. They see what's happening, so they kind of shot themselves in the foot. I don't know that this King Cotton diplomacy ever had a prayer of working, even if they hadn't bungled this. But winking at local merchant societies or committees of vigilance and so on in places like Wilmington and the main cotton ports, or in New Orleans, to deliberately withhold cotton exports, it didn't work. And so the papers of Jefferson Davis, for example, are filled with people writing to him asking for a license to export cotton. And he has to write back, or have his secretary write back to all these folks saying, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no cotton embargo. We have no policy on this. And yet, in their correspondence with one another, they are of course not averse to this continuing. So they publicly disavow it. Privately, they are more than happy to try to make this work. It just fails utterly because they don't think this through.
I always have to smile at some of the self-inflicted wounds that the Confederacy made in the international sphere. That is, not saying that even if they had better staff or not done that, they would have been more successful. But just sometimes a tragedy of errors that they engage in. So let's talk about the Bahamas, because the Bahamas are your first kind of case study of the three. and we'll see maybe time-wise, maybe we'll just do one other afterwards to kind of talk about. But so the Bahamas, hey, great vacation spot. I think that's why you picked it, right?
I was accused of that by my peers in graduate school. Yes.
So you actually go to the
But
Bahamas for research
I did.
purposes?
I did research at the Bahamas. Yep, I did. I did research at the Bahamas Archives. They have some useful material there, and it's also a lovely place to visit in February if you live in Canada.
Oh God, yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, it's pretty cold in Canada in February. So, but when we think of the Bahamas, it's not a lot of ways in and out of it. It's shallow water. So, from a maritime perspective, it's not a great shipping area.
No, it's not, and but it has the benefit of being British and being relatively close to the southern coast, right? So it is, one of the early comments you get is, why the Bahamas? Is it just geography? And the answer is, geography matters. That's not deniable, but there's more to it, right? There is, we've hinted at some of this already, but there are longstanding ties of kinship, of honor culture between, especially kind of the white elite in Nassau and the South. Much of the Bahamas population was relocated from the U.S. after the American Revolution. There's a big loyalist influx. Many of those folks left later on, but quite a few stayed and kind of intermarried with the local population. And importantly, many of them brought their enslaved people with them too, which will have other effects for support for the Union in outlying areas. But certainly the white elite mostly favors the Confederacy quite strongly. One of the early kind of commercial links between the Confederate military apparatus and the Bahamas was brought through by this kinship network, by a Confederate officer from Key West, which is largely settled by white Bahamians, knew the merchant community in Nassau. He brought his connections to Richmond, and that's how kind of the first early efforts to use Nassau as a transshipment point for weapons and supplies coming in and cotton going out is linked to these family networks. But it's more than just that, though, right? These colonies did not have to allow this type of shipment operation to go through. And the reason it starts, of course, in Nassau and later on in Bermuda is because the blockade is gradually growing more effective as 1861 goes on. There's very little blockade running traffic in Nassau in 1861, not until the very end of the year. The same holds true for Bermuda and elsewhere. Most of the first big efforts managed to mostly go directly in from Europe. But it quickly becomes clear that a large sailing ship or even steamship will not be able to escape the blockade. So you need a place to put it on smaller, faster vessels to try to escape the blockaders. And Nassau is ideally suited for that because it is the closest port of any size to both the main Atlantic coast ports that are still in Confederate hands at Charleston and Wilmington. The Union Navy seizes the entrance to Savannah, as you well know, early on. The same with Fernandina in Florida. And so the ports that have rail connections are at these two sites, and the Bahamas are fairly well suited for that. But of course, it doesn't mean that they had to allow this type of shipping operation to take place. It takes Bahamians like Henry Adderley, who's the richest man in the Bahamas. He is not the descendant of loyalists, but he intermarried with a loyalist family. He was deeply opposed to abolition in 1833 and 1834. And he is also kind of the grand old man of Bahamas politics. And he puts the weight of his firm behind the Confederate effort right away. He lends his connections to helping arrange transshipment of goods from these larger vessels onto smaller, faster ships to run into the Confederacy. He leans on the legislature to change the laws to make this legal, because it wasn't legal to break bulk of cargo. It takes Adderley and his allies to intervene in politics and change the rules. And that really matters, right? This is not in places like Canada basically said no to exporting arms and equipment to the Confederacy almost immediately when the war broke out. We're on either side, but really it affects the Confederacy. So colonies didn't have to say yes to this, and they actually changed the laws to help their friends. And the early Confederate representatives there, in the person of Lewis Heiliger, noted this right away. They said, "It's through the influence of our friends that we're able to use Nassau as a de facto port of the Confederacy." Of course, Adderley stands to benefit financially from this, but he believes that this is the right thing to do, and so he lends his not inconsiderable power. He's a big fish in a very small pond, but he is important in Nassau, and that matters for the fate of the Confederate war effort tremendously, it turns out.
Yeah, and I kind of we're right to have kind of a real important part of the kind of Nassau story, but the other part of the Bahamas is that you have a lot of small islands. So even if Nassau didn't work in your favor, you had a lot of other places where you could kind of find an island where you anchor and transship, right? That would have been another possibility, I assume.
Possibility, but it would be much more difficult. You're
Mm-hmm.
having an actual sheltered port in Nassau with facilities both for doing that, for warehousing, importantly, because things had to go in and out, to go on shore quite a bit, and then for things like repair facilities and places for sailors to do things on shore also mattered. And so having Nassau as opposed to having to hide on some island inlet to do these kind of things, it really did matter. It made it much more effective for the Confederacy, especially as they turn to steam-powered blockade runners, which need large supplies of coal. And so that being able to load coal in bulk on steamships, you really do need a port to do this. And so that's why having access to Nassau and later on St. George's and Bermuda really, really mattered for blockade running. It wouldn't have worked without these places. And it took the active support of the local white elite to make that happen.
Yeah, the other part with this is that knowing that Bermuda and Nassau are the two places where the blockade runners for Charleston and Wilmington come out of, there's sort of a double blockade that you can now institute, right? You could sit outside of these ports in international waters and be like, if we don't catch them here, we'll catch them on the other side. But there are
Certainly.
two places where we can
And
catch
yes, and the U.S. Navy tries that, of course, and with somewhat more effectively in the Bahamas and Bermuda because of the distances involved.
them.
And this is interesting. If we're going to kind of jump ahead a little bit in the book to one of the later chapters, we look at black colonial support for the Union in this case, is really matters for these these blockading efforts outside of Nassau and so on, because there are the black population of the Bahamas is caught between a rock and a hard place. They're for the most part desperately poor. They are often beholden to white absentee landowners who are the same folks supporting the Confederacy for employment, for patronage, for where they live in many cases. And so it is risky to defy them. And I think it's notable how many of them do, especially away from Nassau, where they're not quite under the same kind of constant surveillance of the pro-Confederate states. So, they do things like act as kind of, coastal pilots for the U.S. Navy. They help pass messages. They raise signals reporting when blockade runners are moving around. They bring fresh food and water and supplies and sell it to Union ships as a source of revenue. And frankly, because they support what the northern side of the war. And it's notable, this support is definitely increases after the Emancipation Proclamation is issued. There isn't much in the way of kind of written documentary record from these folks. They're mostly illiterate, and it's the same problem of studying any subaltern group is that the lack of kind of archival capture of what they say and think. But we have just in the accounts of U.S. Navy officers, we can see a fairly a marked rise in their willingness to take risks to help the U.S. Navy try to patrol blockade running. That said, it was very difficult to do. Right, a steamship, unless they knew for sure or with some reasonable suspicion that it was bound for a Confederate port, it was risky to stop it and board it. These blockade running ships are very fast, especially because the slow ones are all captured. So what's left are the fast ones, and so they are difficult to catch unless you are perfectly positioned. And so, even though you can set up off, especially in the Bahamas, you can set up in these narrow passages that they have to get through, it is still very challenging to capture them, and most successfully run back and forth. Of course, they have to take the long way around sometimes. It is riskier. It increases the opportunity cost of running the blockade. To have to always be running away from Union Navy ships, and so the support of these of the black population, especially in what they called at the time the out islands of the Bahamas, was really important for making blockade running more expensive and more risky for the pro-Confederate side of things. Having these two ports did make it easier in some ways to where they're going to, where they're coming from. On the other hand, the ocean is a big place, and it was. For the most part, they were able to avoid Union cruisers until they came to the bottleneck of the ports on the coast, where they, just as the Union knows where the Confederates are coming out of, they also know where they're going for the most part, and so they're trying to wait for them there off the coast of South Carolina Wilmington there.
And since you opened the door for the African American or the Afro Caribbean story a little bit, I kind of was also very fascinated by your story about the Afro Caribbean pilots that worked for the United States Navy, and how the white authorities in the Bahamas then are like, oh, you're violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. Like, so in part I'm kind of like, maybe tell us a little bit of like how can you justify prosecuting somebody who is literally helping navigate like any other ship, like, but you're prosecuting them because they help navigate through these narrow channels, a U.S. naval vessel. But then on the other hand, I'm kind of thinking of like, they are being put on trial, so maybe that could be a source to kind of find information of why they are maybe supportive to the United States.
Yeah, so these pilots. So as for readers who aren't as nautical as us, a pilot is a person who's brought aboard to help navigate a ship through either troubled waters or into and out of a port because they have local knowledge, and they're really important in blockade running. For Confederate harbor pilots, they were going in and out of these Confederate ports. They were paid a huge sum in gold for every voyage. They're that important. If they were captured by the U.S., they would let the other civilian crewmen go. Pilots were never released if they could help it. They would find excuses to hang on to them, and the same holds true for these. For most of the pilots in the Bahamas are black. The Nassau Harbor pilots are, they bring ships in and out of the harbor there. But there's also coast pilots who help navigate among the coastal waters of the islands. This is a less formally regulated job than a harbor pilot, but they're really important because the Bahamas are very treacherous. I mean, I invite any listener to pull up a satellite map of the Bahamas and look how much green there is. It is really shallow. And if you don't know where you are, and in the 19th century, ship captains often didn't know exactly where they were because of navigation challenges, it would be easy to run aground or wreck your vessel on a reef. And quite a few ships do come to grief in the Bahamas during the war. And so these pilots are really important for helping find narrow passages to intercept blockade runners, to help keep American ships off the rocks, quite literally in this case. But they ran the risk of doing so because as soon as these the pro-Confederate folks in Nassau find out that they're doing this, because there are informants everywhere, they try to prosecute them. These guys, their name goes on the list. They're arrested. They're charged with violating the Foreign Enlistment Act, which prohibits British subjects from enrolling in the armed forces of a conflict in which they have declared neutrality. But as you mentioned, they were not enrolled in the armed forces of the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Yeah, they were working for them as a contractor. In some ways, it is no different than what the majority of the white population of Nassau is doing for the Confederacy. They are working for them for pay, but they are not members of the armed forces. I think they justify this by their continued presence on a U.S. naval ship, as kind of as ludicrous as that might be, and I think it's important to note that a large proportion of the crews of Confederate commissioned warships, like the Alabama, like the Florida, which makes its escape from Nassau and is commissioned there in Bahamian waters, they are British subjects themselves. They are never once pulled off a Confederate warship when they come into a Confederate harbor. None of them that I'm aware of are charged with violating the Foreign Enlistment Act. This is racially and kind of ideologically motivated prosecution of these guys, and to make sure that they get convictions, they stack the deck. They change the jury system. They use this system kind of dates back to the efforts to prosecute pirates in the old times. But they can change the jury qualifications to make sure you get a property class of people who are exclusively white on a jury in the Bahamas. And so all these pilots were convicted in short order, despite the fact that, as their lawyers pointed out, and importantly, I think their lawyers are some of the prominent members of the mixed race community in Nassau. They're the only two. We call them black now, but they called themselves colored at the time. Lawyers in the Bahamas represented these pilots. They pointed out that, of course, they didn't break the law. There is no evidence that they were enrolled in the armed forces of the U.S. Didn't matter. They were convicted and given very harsh sentences compared to white people accused of similar crimes in the Bahamas or elsewhere in the British Empire. And so, and that's not an accident. That was the Nassau elite sending a message to the black population to don't support our opponents in this conflict, or you will pay. And so I think it's notable that so many folks continued to help the U.S. Navy at great risk for themselves, their freedom or their job, because the other consequence is informal, refusal to employ them. That happened to quite a few wrecker captains, captains of these salvage vessels who were often black. If they got caught helping the U.S. Navy, they would lose their employment, and their families is now left in dire straits. And so this was not without risk, and most of these guys did this with little or no promise of pay. And I think it speaks to this broader kind of failure of Confederate informal diplomacy. They cultivated great support among the white elites in the Bahamas, in Bermuda, and in portions of Canada. Not everyone, but in portions of Canadian society as well. They failed utterly to do the same among the majority of black populations of Bahamas and Bermuda.
And since we're kind of talking about the Bahamas too here, and it was a former slave society, and slavery ended with the British ending slavery in the 1840s. So the economics in the islands, that's probably the best term here, isn't the greatest prior to the Civil War. So this, in many ways, it's actually an economic boon for the for everyone, right?
Oh, absolutely. These are like probably the best economic times the Bahamas has seen, maybe ever, and they wouldn't see again until rum running during Prohibition in some ways. So there's that smuggling is great business there, and until tourism really kind of becomes a thing. But that's more a 20th century phenomenon. This is really important economically for the islands, and I think it's worth remembering that not every black subject of the Bahamas actually supported the Union, in part because they had mouths to feed. They needed income, and working on the docks for these blockade running outfits was a source of ready cash, of steady employment. And that's hard to sneer at. And so we have isolated reports from American consuls and so on of parties of black Bahamians kind of hooting and engaging in public revelry with pro-Confederate folks or with Confederate sailors, things like that. And that's understandable in the context of where their employment comes from. Then from some of that's just young men having fun together too. And of course, the American consul kind of leaned out his window and shook up a Charleston paper at them and said, look who you're supporting. This, and I think that was a fair point, but one that a drunken 18-year-old probably isn't all that listening to all that closely. And so but it's the economic benefit was hard to ignore, especially in these places, because they had not been big sugar producing colonies. The soil was not well suited to it. They tried cotton cultivation as well, and with the same problem. It is not a place built for large scale agriculture, and so the population there is even during the time of slavery was engaged in a wide variety of work that wasn't deeply tied up with plantation agriculture. So things like sponge fishing, small scale gardening, growing pineapples for a while. A lot of work boat building and being sailors as well. Salt raking is a big business as well. So the blockade running is huge, and you can't ignore the role of this prosperity in cultivating sport, especially among the white elite for the Confederates, but even among the non-white population, there is you can see why they did benefit in some ways from this boost of shipping activity. Of course, it was short-lived, and again, but I think it also is a good reminder of how notable it is that there was so much tacit and overt support for the Union, even when it went against their economic interest to do so.
Right. Now, you stepped into my trap now, so now comes the tough question, because this is something that has been on my mind for a long time, that in very different places, different ways. So we're talking about the Confederate States here, that is creating an economic boom. This is a country, quote unquote country, that has a hyperinflationary currency, has very limited gold or silver reserves, is getting money from the international stock markets was the Erlanger loan and things of that nature. How do you make money here? Because it's like every time they give you a Confederate dollar, it's like it's worthless pieces of paper. Are all these merchants that speculated on the Confederacy, like ending up at the end of the war with like huge debts that are like they can't get anything off, or what?
Uh,
What's going on here?
so let's go back to the title. They are we can remove the king, but what they want is cotton. Like that
Hmm.
is what motivates this. You know, they are just as you are mentioned. They are very aware that Confederate currency is worthless from the get go. They
Hmm.
won't even accept Confederate money for the most part
Hmm.
as payment. They require payment either in hard currency, gold or silver, or cotton, because the Confederacy has very little hard currency, as you noted. And so what they want, again, they want cotton because what they can do is they can buy it for practically nothing in Confederate ports and resell it at a huge profit when they get either to Nassau or St. George's, or when they ship it back to ports in Europe, especially in England, but also in France. And in some cases, some of this cotton actually makes its way to the northern states as well to fuel Union mills, which was a concern of the U.S. Treasury throughout the war. Um, but yeah, so the cotton is what they want, and this kind of where the interests of blockade runners and the Confederate war efforts start to diverge is over what comes in and what goes out on these blockade running vessels. And so while this blockade running edifice is really convenient for the Confederate States because they don't have to bear any risk. They don't. It's not their ships. It's not their people that are taking the risk. But increasingly what they're required to do is to persuade ships to carry cargo into Confederate ports. They have to pay very high shipping rates, and many times what the peacetime rate would be, and they have to pay it up front. So if the cargo is captured, they still are out the money, and very often, even then, some shippers would go in ballast. They would go run into a Confederate port and bring nothing if they could get away with it, because they could carry less coal and have more room on the way out for cotton, because they didn't care about what they brought in some of these outfits. They just wanted to get cotton out, and so as that increasingly becomes a risk, either what's coming in is frivolities, booze, or dresses and shoes for women, or linens, or trinkets and things like that. Stuff that's low volume of cargo space but high dollar value. Uh, that's what's coming in many cases, not heavy, bulky things that you need like saltpeter or lead or medicine or boots or uniforms, military goods. Those they have to persuade blockade runners to carry those in some cases at very disadvantageous freight rates, because all they want is that cotton, because that's where the money is. And so they're making huge profits on every bale they run out, but that money is accruing in most cases to these private parties and not to Confederate Treasury accounts. And so that is where, as we get into the midpoint of the war, the Confederate Congress belatedly tries to take some control of this. And so their early permissiveness in allowing private parties to run this commercial diplomatic network, as I call it, comes back to bite them. They have a hard time getting it under control because the people involved have a lot to lose in terms of profits by relinquishing this. And so, there are belated efforts by the Confederate government starting in 1863 to require that ships reserve some portion of their cargo for things going in and out. In the interest of time, I won't belabor that point, but they try it. It works a little bit, but it is too little, too late. And in many cases, these colonial trading networks, who are made up of both Confederate citizens and British subjects, actively resist complying with them. And they're enabled in this in some cases, by Confederate governors like Zebulon Vance and Brown in Georgia, because they have a state interest in some cases of keeping separate blockade running networks going. So this is not at all a well-oiled logistical machine in some ways by the Confederacy. So they try to solve this in different ways with regulation. The War Department is operating its own line of steamers, which goes well at first, but bad luck strikes them. They lose quite a few in short order to the blockade. And so it is a struggle throughout the war to bring in these low dollar value, high need items for the Confederate war effort. And that's because they outsourced so much of this logistical network to private parties early on in the war, when it was really to their advantage. And then they struggled to seize control of it as things got desperate.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of a great way to think of the differences between Bermuda and Bahamas in your, at least in your book. You can maybe elaborate on it a little bit more here, but in the Bahamas, you really talk about the Ordnance Bureau and what's his face here, Gorgas, how he sort of using the Bahamas, Bermuda as sort of getting military equipment into the Confederacy of vans, North Carolina's blockade running fleets that goes into Bermuda to kind of get cotton out, and then needed goods for the North Carolina troops, of course, into the state. But was because most of what you're talking about is Bermuda focused? Is that similar in the Bahamas, or is Bahamas more focused on like private individuals?
Yeah.
And
So there are private blockade running firms in both places, but the Confederate government efforts where they have formal control of blockade running lines are concentrated in Bermuda. One, because it wasn't as busy as Nassau. It's a little bit further away. It's slightly less advantageous because you have to carry more coal to run it out, which means less cargo space. And so each run was slightly less profitable than a run in and out of Nassau. But what that meant was there was more room for setting up an operation kind of under more direct Confederate government control there, and then to expand that, they had access to dock space and wharfage and warehousing and so on. And so the Confederate formal effort, especially under the aegis of the War Department, is centered in Bermuda and under the control of an officer, Norman S. Walker. He's a major in the Confederate Army. And so this unusual, the Nassau blockade running outfits, for the most part, are private organizations, with some Confederate cooperation. There's deep cooperation with merchants in Charleston and Wilmington, in each place. And the Confederate official government representation, such that it exists in Nassau, is working hand in hand with Adderley and with these private shippers. In Bermuda, by contrast, there is a formal Confederate office. They rent office space. They have a military officer and several clerks employed there. They still lean heavily on local factors and merchants to help them kind of run the nuts and bolts of the operation. But yeah, so they lean heavily on this in Bermuda, in part because there is space available there for them to build this network out. And it's also they have the advantage there of having connections, slightly easier connections from Bermuda both to Europe and to British North America from Bermuda than you do from Nassau. So that as far as for official communications, for example, Bermuda is more advantageous. There's a regular steamship service, and Royal Navy vessels would carry mail bags, and so a lot of Confederate mail goes to Europe and elsewhere in the holds of the Royal Navy, unawares in most cases, but they were able to use that network to help kind of control their efforts around the world.
So you mentioned some of the advantages, but there's also that the Royal Navy is sort of a disadvantage in that you have the massive naval base for the North America Squadron in Bermuda, and obviously Halifax has some of it as well. But you have, I would assume, frequent visits of Admiral Milne to Bermuda at this time, so that puts a little bit more of a lens on the activities than you would have in the Bahamas.
Certainly it does, and I think so. You see slightly less in the way of really from both the Union and the Confederate side. There's a little less official or obvious skullduggery happening there. But that said, when Admiral Milne, he's only there a portion of the year, and several of his commanders are quite sympathetic to the Confederacy. And there's also kind of the famous role of kind of furloughed British naval officers commanding blockade runners themselves. Augustus Hobart Hampton being the most famous one, but there were others. So there's among the lower line officers of the Royal Navy, there is substantial support for the Confederate cause as well. And so while Milne is there, people are on a straight and narrow. He is very much an astute diplomat. His concern is keeping this from getting out of hand. He is very even-handed. But when he's away, we see things like the commander of the Royal Dockyard in Bermuda allowing blockade runners to repair themselves using his facilities, which is, they're not supposed to let any civilian ship use them, much less one that's directly involved in the contraband trade for the Confederacy. And yet the commander there does that. Notably, Milne finds out about this, and they keep it quiet. As far as I'm aware, the United States does not discover that Royal Navy facilities are being used to repair and support blockade running. The British keep them from finding out because it would have been a huge diplomatic blow up. But it goes to show how when Milne isn't there, they can still get away with some of the stuff, even in places with heavy royal presences from the Navy and Army at Bermuda and in Halifax.
Sort of reminds me, like, Daddy is out of the house, so we can have a party.
Yes, exactly.
Uh,
When the cat's away, the mice will play.
yeah, exactly. So, but the other part was Bermuda is that, um, and you have a couple of interesting episodes there in the book, which the Confederates treat African American or Afro Bermudian dock workers and individuals working in the harbors rather poorly. And I mean, that kind of aligns with what you have in the Bahamas. But you do point to a strike by these individuals to illustrate a little more that there's more activism to kind of not let themselves be treated like that.
Bingo. This strike has not been written on much at all that I could find before this.
Yeah.
And so in the summer of 1863, there is a strike, a violent strike by black dock workers in St. George's, centered on the folks who work for the Confederate Shipping Office, but it kind of spreads across across the city over low pay and poor working conditions. And this incident I think is a great example of one, both the ability of local black populations to organize themselves. This goes back to the heritage of things like friendly societies and fraternal organizations that pop up in the both even before the end of slavery, but certainly in its aftermath, quite robustly in Bermuda. And on the other side of it, this is one of those failings of Confederate informal diplomacy, which is really successful at cultivating the lower military elite and the white merchant population of Bermuda rather, but does it again because of this kind of racial myopia is unable to consider that perhaps the support of the population might also matter. And so instead of offering, the strikers were demanding a modest pay increase, and given the inflation that the blockade running trade brought on, it was not unusual. But they were utterly refused it. They were spoken to in derogatory terms, of course, by Walker and by his supporters and peers, and so they walk off the job. Walker, the Confederate shipping agent, crisscrossed the island trying to recruit scabs to break the strike. He has a very difficult time doing that. Those that show up are met with violence by the strikers, and and while this is going on, there's the town attempts to negotiate or mediate a settlement. One of the mediators, as someone tries to kill him in the dark, it's suspected that one of the strikers did this. But despite a huge reward offered for information about this, no one stepped forward, which suggests the solidarity of this movement. And ultimately, despite Walker's wife in her diary is noting how it's with kind of the racial language of the day, how these folks they would be better off enslaved, and all these horrible things that Confederates tended to say when they encountered free black people in British colonies. Also noted that what a big win it was for us. These workers went back to work, and it turns out that they went back to work because they got the pay raise they were asking for. The Confederates kind of meekly accepted this with their tail between their legs. They rehired them, and business went back to normal after a successful labor action that was accompanied, in the midst I didn't mention, but by a huge cotton fire on the docks that was probably set deliberately by the strikers to pressure the Confederate operation. It was the loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars in 1860s money in gold of cotton. So it was violent. It involved arson and sabotage, and it worked. The pro-Confederate interest was forced to accede to this strike, and it inspired a similar strike in Nassau the following year. It's clear that they knew what happened there. That one was settled much more quietly before it got violent. There's some social differences as well between the two places. But this is an incident that shows that the limitations of this informal diplomatic approach that the Confederacy took, and it was and the importance of considering cultural factors in these diplomatic relations. Right?
And also kind of just thinking, right? Like strikers usually during this time, whether we look at the 1877 Great Strike in the U.S. or even like trade unionism in Great Britain, strikers are usually being given a hard time by the authorities.
Yeah, and it's notable that the British authorities
have
do
a lot
not.
of power.
Yeah. And so it is notable that the power of the state is not directed against them, and I think that's probably because of who they're working for.
But so like, I don't want to start Canada because you have to run to class and teach here in a few minutes. So we'll leave Canada for the readers to discover, and there's some fun stories in your Canada section
Yeah.
to look at. But kind of thinking a little bit hypothetically, and as historians, we usually don't like doing that, but I want to put you on the spot a little bit on with that. So do you think, like, if the Confederacy had acted more strategically, whether that is not doing the cotton embargo, more proactively kind of done what maybe Vance or Gorgas in the Ordnance Bureau had done on an official level, that not say wins a war, but been able to prolong the war and make it more costly for the United States?
Yeah, I absolutely. And so there is a world where I mean I don't know that I always caution my students against saying things like something was inevitable,
Mm-hmm.
but it certainly Northern victory with effective leadership when Grant takes command, especially becomes much more likely. Um, on the other hand, if the Confederacy had leaned a little more carefully on pre-war planning, on not alienating key populations in these colonies, on being a little smarter with how they conducted this type of trading and diplomatic behavior, there is a world where their supply situation is not as dire, where their financial situation isn't as dire in 1863 and 1864, and they can more effectively resist. Because when the Confederate armies start coming apart at the seams in 1864 and 65, it's because of desertion, and a lot of that is linked to. I mean, there are there's lots of stuff going on, but their families suffering at home, not being paid, not having enough to eat, not having clothes to wear. All that stuff drags on an army eventually. And if the Confederacy could at least ameliorate some of those problems, there's a world where there is a much stouter resistance to Union forces throughout the fall of 1864 and 1865. And who knows, maybe with a slightly more robust forces, the Atlanta campaign doesn't go as well. Perhaps Lincoln loses in 1864. There is a world where it might have mattered in some ways. I don't think that it would have resulted in a Confederate military conquest of the North or something, or a dramatic recognition by Britain of the Confederate independence before it's accomplished in fact. But you can imagine a world where a more careful and studious approach to this, but while still leaning on these informal approaches, might have made a difference in the outcome of the war. And we can say that the success they did have in these building these relationships in the colonies really did matter for keeping the war going as long as it did. Right, a huge proportion of Confederate weapons and equipment came through the blockades, like 2/3 of it. Most of that came through Nassau and Bermuda, and most of it went into those Atlantic ports. And without local support especially in Nassau, but also in Bermuda, it wouldn't have been possible. And so I think the Confederacy is drowned in the bathtub in 1862 without this. In my that's my hot take. So it did matter. It did matter for the war. And had it been managed better, it might have dragged things out long enough to perhaps wear down Union morale and will to fight. I don't know.
Yeah, and kind of following up on that, it came to mind too, because we have a good solid debate nowadays about the Alabama, right? Where it's the O'Murley school that says Britain did not do anything wrong. The U.S. was too slow in kind of producing the evidence. The Confederates were kind of onto them, and kind of that's how the Alabama slipped out. Or kind of the other side, the Sumner side, if you like, that says, the daft British just that gave the Confederates that ability to get the Alabama out before they had the evidence to force them to contain that ship. So, how do you feel like I'm pretty sure there's sort of in the minds of a number of politicians during this time, sort of perception of the British should have done more in the Bahamas or Bermuda to stop this activity. But kind of just in the thought process, could the Colonial Office and by default also the Royal Navy done anything to stop this? Could it have been effectively curtailed at all?
Not without seriously disrupting the kind of the colonial order that emerged after the American Revolution. Right, it's built on retaining loyalty, allowing devolving governance where possible to prevent another giant uprising against imperial control. And so I think and then we see that in the way that Canada is governed after the rebellions in 1837, 1838. And there's similar less intense problems in the Bahamas as well, where they are trying to strike a balance between this. There's a growing movement for greater democracy even in Britain in this time, And so there's less appetite to retrench governance, except in extreme situations like you see in Jamaica after the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865. Before then, even there was a deep reluctance by the Colonial Office to pull back local autonomy, except in exceptional circumstances. And so I think they would have had a hard time doing this in the Bahamas or in Canada or Bermuda in the absence of really severe provocation. They come close in Canada in some ways in the run up to the war, which we're out of time for that, but we'll have to leave that for readers to discover in the book. But yeah, I think that, there is, if I don't know that without totally turning on its head the structure of imperial governance, especially among places governed as ethnically white as the Bahamas and Bermuda were, even though they were majority black. I don't think that they can pull this off without really causing themselves problems elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, but that doesn't mean like we should blame the British for assisting the Confederates.
No, and I think that's, if we go back to, again, these private parties, they have agency. They will. People can make choices and do things, regardless of what the government wants them to do. Even in the case of the escape of the Alabama, which is, I think you have the connivance of local customs officials. You have there's also bureaucratic uncertainty. The authorities may not have been certain that it was legal for them to seize the Alabama. So, in the case of its sister ship, the Florida, it was much more cut and dried, and yet locals in the Bahamas helped them get away anyway. So it's there. In some ways, the Florida is a much more clear-cut case of malfeasance than the Alabama, despite having a somewhat less successful run as a commerce raider. But yeah, I think it is. Are the British responsible for the damages? Probably, in a court of law. Could they have done much different in the case of the Alabama? I don't think so. And it goes back to that, private agency and the ability of people within the government. If we can get conspiratorial modern style, say the deep state is resisting efforts to do something it doesn't want. In this case, it's people with independent agency and some level of bureaucratic autonomy doing what they see is in their interest.
Sounds great. All right, but you have to run to class here in a few minutes. And what are you teaching?
I'm teaching Introduction to Military History. So today, in fact, we're going to talk about the rise of industrialized warfare and steamships and armored battleships and all these things.
Like the Crimean War.
Yeah, well, it sure does.
Well, I would love to be in Calgary right now and listen to that class and ask some tough questions.
You've enough today.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure, Beau. So if you're interested in Beau's book, it's Between King Cotton and Queen Victoria, How Pirates, Smugglers, and Scoundrels Almost Saved the Confederacy by UGA Press. So, Beau, thank you for taking little time this morning to talk about your book between dropping kids off and talking to other kids.
That's right. I appreciate it, Nils. I love to talk about this stuff, obviously, and I'm looking forward to further conversations down the road.
I hope so. All right.